Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, what ought we do?
I suppose we ought to eat lunch. Why?
No, not like that. I mean, what ought we do to end this life? What does the Buddha say we should do?
I suppose he would say that what we do and do not do is not so important as why we do it. We cannot think of morality as absolute and unchanging, nor can we think of it only in terms of our individual selves. Will our action, our speech, our thoughts benefit all sentient beings, including ourselves, or will it make their situation even worse than it already is?
Interesting. I suppose we ought to eat lunch then.
Welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. Today we'll be discussing the soul, karma, and morality in Buddhism. What do these all mean? How do they relate to reincarnation? And what does Buddhism say we should do? I hope you enjoy it.
So, first question. Does Buddhism believe in the existence of a soul?
The answer to that question depends on how we define soul, so I'm just going to give the most common definition that you get whenever you Google it. The Google definition reads, the spiritual or immaterial part of a human being or animal regarded as immortal. So let's go term by term here and look at what Buddhist doctrine has to say about this. Let's start with the word spiritual. Spiritual in Buddhism does not equal immaterial. It doesn't mean something that's intangible or not sensible for Buddhists. For many Buddhists, spirituality is not a category that is separate from anything in regular life even. There's not a simple distinction between the spiritual and the mundane. This speaks to an important doctrine that we haven't mentioned yet called non-duality. Non-duality is an extension of the doctrine of emptiness. Basically, if everything is empty of inherent and unchanging existence, then the distinctions we impose upon the world, such as material and immaterial, spiritual and mundane, good and bad, self and other, all of these are imaginary and misguided. They're not related to anything real about the world around us. The next word in the definition that we should look at is immaterial. Immaterial is not a way that many Buddhists view the universe. Immaterial and material is a Western philosophical distinction based on what can be grasped by our classic five senses and what cannot. However, it's important to note that in Buddhism, there's actually 6 senses. There's the normal 5 senses plus the mind. So if the nose smells scents and the eye sees things that are visible, the mind cognizes things that can be thought about, can be recognized by the mind. So there's nothing at all, according to Buddhism, that is not sensible or tangible by one or more of the 6 senses. The last word we should look at in the definition is immortal. Immortal doesn't jive with emptiness and impermanence. Many Buddhists, therefore, don't believe in what Westerners would call a soul. However, there is something important that we should discuss in that. In the absence of a soul, what actually gets reincarnated in Buddhism? How does that work? We'll devote more time to this in the future, but there's a lot of different opinions on this in Buddhism, and the short answer is that our karmic consciousness is propelled through the cycle of birth and rebirth through our karmic action. In other words, the only way to be released from the cycle of birth and rebirth is to purify past karma and to do behaviors that only produce meritorious karma.
So before we move on into the subject of karma, which we're getting into next, so there's no such thing as a soul in Buddhism, and that makes sense based on impermanence. So I'm interested in this idea of the mind as a sense. That's a new one on me a little bit. So basically, Buddhism puts ideas such as imagination and, having thoughts as a sense rather than an action.
Exactly, yes. However, I would caution you against a duality between sense and action. So, imagination, recollection, recognizing people, recognizing ideas, thinking about things in a discriminatory fashion. And I don't mean discriminatory as in like racist or sexist. I mean discriminatory as in this is not that and that is not this. That's karmic action. That is a karmic behavior that we are in control of, according to this Buddhist view. So sensing is, according to some schools of Buddhism, reaching out with the aggregates of the mind, of form, of the five senses, etc., and filling in a space or a category or an interpretation that is what they call self-asserting or self-affirming. And this behavior is habit, and it's determined by our past karma, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's also directly against the teaching of Buddhism, which is that there is no self. So whenever we think about, okay, computer screen is not internet, and keyboard is not words that it types, these kinds of discriminatory thought processes are karmic, and they are sort of like meaningless distinctions that we pose onto the world to affirm and create evidence that we are a self that is unchanging and that is separate or different or distinctive from all other things, selves in the universe.
So that, I'm trying to run that through my head now. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think I get this one. I get the idea of there being no soul. That's not where I'm having a problem with it. My problem here is, I suppose I'm not seeing clearly why there is no distinction between thought and action in this case.
Yeah, so let me explain it in a different way. If I can make a list of things that are this thing and not another thing, if I can look and start naming things and start coming up with reasons why they are the thing that they are called and not something else, it's a lot easier for me to look at myself and say to myself, I am me and not anything or anyone else. So the more evidence that I create around me that things are what they are and not anything else, the more evidence I create that I am a person, a self, a soul, and like a permanent, unchanging thing and not anything else. For Buddhists, discriminatory, categorical, analytical thought is the departure point on a short trip to solipsism.
So basically, the idea is to stop looking for evidence that you are a self?
Right, exactly, because the evidence isn't there. And if we look for it, we will find it because it's our habit. It's what we would call in the West unconscious action for us to impose this evidence on a world that doesn't inherently have any evidence for it. The reason why the Buddha is thought of as being omniscient is because he saw through the illusion that things are what they are and not something else. He saw through the distinctions and he had an insight into this non-duality doctrine that we're talking about.
Maybe this will become clearer to me when we actually dig into non-duality.
I think so. And that is another one, just like emptiness and karma, that it could take an entire episode to really unpack.
Yeah, so In the interest of that, I'm going to put a pin in this conversation and we can pick this up when we start talking about non-duality in detail. So let's move on to the next big question, which is, what is karma?
This is a good question and a very important question with regards to Buddhism. In the West, everybody has their own idea of what karma is. I've mentioned in a previous episode that we have this idea that karma means, put simply, what goes around comes around. Our action now will reflect on our experience later. And this is partially true, but is a much larger time scale, and it is larger than the scale of the individual. So let's dig in. Karma refers to, in short, the reflexivity of reality or of the universe. To explain this, let's back out of Buddhism and into physics and thermodynamics for a moment. In physics and thermodynamics, we have concepts such as conservation of energy, which are useful for understanding how karma works. Don't mistake me for saying that physics and Buddhism intersect. Ancient Buddhists did not think themselves physicists, and physicists today are not working to affirm and prove Buddhism as factual. But this is just me starting from somewhere familiar to explain something unfamiliar. Starting with conservation of energy, we can see that energy cannot be created from nothing or destroyed into nothing. It can only be concentrated and dissipated by physical processes, all under the fundamental law that any action results in an equal reaction. Our behaviors, including our thoughts, beliefs, words, actions, goals in life, follow the exact same law. For example, the action of speaking a racial slur is a concentration of one's thoughts and feelings and beliefs into an action that releases those thoughts, feelings, beliefs into the universe. The emotional energy behind that act dissipates, and we can replace emotional with karmic energy in this sentence, dissipates to everybody and powers processes in them as well. It powers feelings of sadness, hurt, anger, pain, or in the worst case, agreement. Thus, by one person acting as such, many persons have been brought down. This then causes their actions, beliefs, words to be governed by those feelings. This is an idea of how karma works in the real world. It's the property of reflexivity in the universe that shapes the causes and conditions in which people, thoughts, beliefs, suffering arise. In a simple phrase, bad begets bad, good begets good, on a population-wide scale, on a potentially infinite time scale. And this karma determines the station of our rebirth, according to Buddhism. How we fill our cognition and what we do with our behaviors, that determines how we are positioned in the universe. I've talked about the 6 realms, sometimes there's 10 realms of rebirth before. Our karma moves us up and down on that scale. And when I say our karma, I do really mean our karma. I don't just mean your karma or my karma. Like I've said before, there is no such thing as your karma or my karma. There's just karma. To go back to the thermodynamics and kinetics analogy, there is not my heat energy and your heat energy. There is just the heat energy of the universe. Karma is how we can reflect back to that.
So that sounds like a way of rephrasing cause and effect, basically. Like the karma of me doing whatever has the effect of causing other people to react in whatever way, and that's a lot simpler than I was expecting, honestly.
Absolutely. And this law of cause and effect is passive. It exists without us existing. Existence is a problematic term in Buddhism, as we've talked about before, but for the sake of conversation, let's use it. Cause and effect and dependent origination exists without you or I existing. Karma is the reins that we have as sentient beings over dependent origination, over cause and effect. We can direct that according to our thoughts, behaviors, actions, goals, concentrations, and shape reality for ourselves accordingly.
Okay. So let's talk about what kind of things we could do to get some good karma, I suppose. What are the moral tenets of Buddhism?
Yeah, this is an important question. So since we have the reins in hand, since we are riding this horse that is dependent origination, the question is, which direction should we go? According to Buddhism, karma can be purified. Bad karma from the past can be made up for in the present. Or good karma can be purified into no karma. Remember that the idea is to reach enlightenment to the point where there is no karma. But that is a long, difficult journey, and we won't get into all the steps to get to that point right now. What we'll do is we'll start with the basics. So, how do we purify our bad karma? And how do we shape our behaviors, thoughts, actions, beliefs, concentrations to those that produce good karma? Remember that there's nothing so simple as good and bad in Buddhism, but there are 5 basic precepts at which we can start. These 5 precepts are non-violence against all sentient beings, no theft, no sexual misconduct, no verbal misconduct, and no consuming intoxicants. These 5 are related to the 10 good deeds, which are not abstinences, but are instead actions that we can do. These 10 good deeds are saving a life, giving alms, sexual abstinence, honesty, concordant speech, affectionate speech, uprightness, mental purity, kindness and compassion, and right view. I'd like to discuss the 5 precepts and a few of the 10 good deeds a little bit more to make them make sense for the 21st century listener. There are those Buddhists out there who, and there's also Jains as well, who practice Jainism, who do this. There are those Buddhists out there who walk everywhere they go with a small broom, and they sweep in front of them everywhere. Why do they do this? They're brushing the bugs off of the path so that they don't step on them and kill them.
Oh, I've seen references to this in video games before. That suddenly makes a lot more sense. Okay.
I would say that that's an extreme interpretation of nonviolence. I definitely don't look down upon it. I have nothing but respect and admiration for those that take it that seriously. But I don't know that that's realistic for all of us. I don't know that there's brooms to be had. I think that nonviolence, as well as some of these other ones, speak more to a mindset that is compassion for all sentient beings. I don't know if we have to go so far, me, you, our listeners, as to carry a broom with us everywhere. But I do think that there are things that we can do according to where we are in the world, where we are in our lives, what resources we have. These things include not eating meat if you don't want to, if you can afford not to, health-wise and finance-wise. There are things like not engaging in killing of animals for sport. There's all kinds of different things we can do. But, for example, using hand sanitizer kills bacteria and viruses. Is that violent? I'm not so sure. It's a little bit of a gray area. Similarly, no verbal misconduct speaks to, what you should not say. But there is no clear, actual, concrete sentences that are written in the texts that the Buddha says, do you see these sentences? Don't ever say any of these. Do you see these words? Don't ever say any of these. I think that these are necessarily a little bit vague so that they can be applied according to a person's circumstances. For example, no consuming intoxicants. Some people consume caffeine in the mornings. And is that an intoxicant? It's technically, according to the chemistry definition, a drug, but does it intoxicate somebody? Does it interfere with their mindfulness, with their nonviolence? I don't know.
I will give a very personal example of this. I mentioned earlier, in an earlier episode rather, that I have a chronic pain condition, and the best medication I have found for that is marijuana. Before that, I was on narcotic pain pills. And it goes back, I think, to something that we said earlier and something that we kind of let go. But intention is really important in Buddhism, right? So, like, if somebody is, I'm using marijuana as a pain medication, that's something I suspect that the Buddha would forgive me for if there is any wrongdoing in it at all anyway. It's more about, by making intention such an important thing, it allows for the wiggle room we need to be able to actually live a reasonable life. Like, for example, not eating meat is not a reasonable option for me. That doesn't have, I can't do that. So by being able to say, well, at least I'm not trophy hunting, for example.
I think that is exactly what is important to know as what I would call a lay person in Buddhism about these precepts. Intention definitely matters, and the mindset behind some of these precepts, such as no consuming intoxicants, is the reasoning is that it interferes with your mindfulness. But the logical response to that is, what's going to interfere with your mindfulness more? Chronic pain, chronic illness, chronic disease, or the relief that you get from that whenever you use some sort of drug or intoxicant. I think that no consuming intoxicants means that you should strive to live a pure and clean life as you can, and avoid addictions, avoid escapism, avoid all of these things that people can fall into whenever they use intoxicants. I don't think that is a strict never use it at all policy. I would argue that it's more about mindfulness and moderation. Now, some of these are non-negotiable. No theft, no sexual misconduct, no verbal misconduct. I think that those actually mean don't do those things. And it's reasonable to assume so. Stealing is wrong. Acting sexually without mutual consent is wrong. And going around saying false or inflammatory or otherwise hurtful words is wrong. These are things that I think are serious. But nonviolence and no consuming intoxicants, they do have some gray areas that I can see pretty clearly that they're not really strongly adhered to by most Buddhists even. For example, I believe that the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, who represents the Tibetan branch of Buddhism, I'm pretty sure that he eats meat. I would have to check this and come back in the show notes about this, but I'm pretty sure that he eats meat because it's not about strictly always eating vegan or vegetarian. It's more about not killing the animal yourself and also not turning away alms. You have to remember that 2,500 years ago, if you are a disciple of the Buddha and you're receiving alms, you can't hand back alms and say, sorry, I don't eat meat. You eat what you're given. And so to that end, though they do not actually do the killing themselves, they actually will eat meat at some different times, some different circumstances. So I think that all of these are a little bit more complicated and a little bit more gray than they might seem on the surface.
All right. I want to look back at the 10 good deeds for just a minute. So most of these make perfect sense to me. I somewhat question sexual abstinence. Is that meaning chastity entirely, or are we talking about not being a jerk about sex?
That's a good question. So the short answer is that the sexual abstinence, the mindset behind that is not to become entangled in the pleasure of sex such that you become addicted, such that you engage in sexual misconduct, such that you interfere with your mindfulness or your view of reality somehow. So how that shakes out in reality is that in Japan, I speak about Japan because it's what I'm most familiar with in my studies, a lot of trained monks who are in charge of the ritual services for a temple, they have families. So they're not celibate. They have families, and a lot of temples are passed down hereditarily, and they have sex.
Okay. Good, because that's one that didn't make sense to me as a good deed by itself. But if we're talking about just not needing it too much, that's a pretty healthy way to approach it.
Absolutely.
I think.
Absolutely. And this issue comes up again as well in something like concordant speech.
I was about to ask about that one too.
Yeah, exactly. Concordant speech, the definition in practice is like agreeing speech or agreeable speech. So it's not speaking out of turn and it's not speaking against. But there's some things that you should speak against. There's plenty of things that, if you're looking to protect, save, care for all sentient beings, there are certainly things that you should not speak against. I think that the mindset behind this is, again, to be mindful of speech, to be mindful and moderate of your speech. And that's where we get this uprightness. This uprightness it speaks a little bit to the Confucian gentleman, though I would personally argue not as sexist as such a Confucian gentleman. This Confucian gentleman is someone who is honest, moderate, listens more than he speaks, and never makes a big row, and he does what he does and gets his ideas through by very calm, mindful, soft non-action rather than being a big, commanding, controlling, intimidating personality. So this is kind of what that speaks to, rather than agreeing with whatever's going on around you, such as Nazism, such as genocide. You don't want to be concordant and agreeable to that. It's more, how do you keep the situation and the circumstances calm, but change them softly? And how do you live your life and actualize yourself without making a big row and a big splash and possibly eliciting poor karma for those around you and for yourself?
So we could perhaps simplify concordant speech as don't be a jerk when you're talking. Gotcha. And then right view. That's a very vague and very concerning thing to see on this list from the aspect of, like, they're trying to... That is a term that brings some unfortunate connotations to my head that seems kind of not... It seems maybe controlling. What does right view actually mean?
That's a good question. Right view it certainly has a lot of connotations, and it at face value, it actually contradicts something that we said before, which is that there is no right and wrong in Buddhism. Right and wrong is a duality, and there is non-duality. Well, this right view was taught to the Buddha's disciples at a very early age, or I guess a very early age in Buddhism as a religion. They were all adults, but it was Buddhism was in its youth. So what a lot of Buddhists have said over the millennia is that the earlier teachings were a more basic, more understandable level, and the later teachings became more complicated and more abstract and esoteric until they reached their highest level of understanding and complexity and enlightening potential. And different schools argue that different sutras or different sermons were the pinnacle of the Buddha's teachings, but that's not important right now. This idea of right view essentially is a view of the world from a place of compassion for all sentient beings. It's not necessarily like a right or left view. It's not necessarily a right or wrong view. It's more a view that comes from the right place. There is no strong moralism in Buddhism in the sense that they don't say often, do this and don't do that. But there is a moralism in the doctrine of karma and in the doctrine of non-duality and interdependence, and in other doctrines that come up like nonviolence and compassion for all sentient beings. This right view is also related to the correct view that there is no self-other distinction, that there is only one or only zero, depending on which Buddhist schools you listen to. It's this view that all things are interdependent, connected, and non-distinct from each other, and empty.
Okay. So right view is about having the right mindset, basically.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, I suspect we're going to get into all of those in more detail in the near future. But for now, we are over 30 minutes, so...
Join us next week when we talk about questions such as, what is the middle way? What is non-attachment? And how is non-attachment different from detachment? Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Our email is bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com.
You can find us on Twitter at Bright Buddhism.
As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.